Yes, welcome everyone. This talk is called "My Startup Failed and All I Got Was This Lousy Lunch and Learn," aka Joe Penn made me do it. No, I actually volunteered, so sorry, Joe. I've divided this presentation into four pretty simple sections. I'm going to start by telling the mostly true story of Castle, my startup, to give everyone some context on the rest of the presentation. I'll share 4 business lessons I took away, 4 personal lessons, and then I'll try to answer this question I'm asked all the time: would you do it all again? So let's start with the mostly true story of Castle, based on a true story. So I never thought I would start a company. I was like a weird artsy child. I was a theater kid. Then I was a creative writing major in college. I wrote a musical. You guys may be familiar with the joke: what's the difference between a creative writing major and a large pizza? A large pizza can feed a family of 4. And then after college, I ended up doing this program called Venture for America, which I think a lot of you have heard of because we have so many alums at VFA alums at On Deck. And I did this program kind of on a whim. I mean, basically, VFA sends recent grads to work at startups in quote unquote emerging economies, but they really mean like shitty cities, basically, places like Detroit. Even then, I sort of thought that I would just check this startup thing out for a year or 2 and then probably go back to writing. I remember at VFA training camp in 2012, Andrew Yang, the founder, asked everyone in the room, raise your hand if you think there's a chance you might start a company one day. And every single person except for me raised their hand. About a year into my time in Detroit, I ended up teaming up with a few friends to buy an abandoned mansion in the Detroit tax auction. Again, just kind of on a whim. We'd noticed that a lot of people were doing this in Detroit, and Detroit was the place that had this kind of DIY spirit where when we asked a few people who knew more about us, more about real estate than us, if they thought this was a crazy idea, amazingly, they all said it wasn't that crazy. So we spent nights and weekends fixing up this place, teaching ourselves from YouTube and friendly neighbors. This was my bedroom for a few months when we moved in, before there was running water or electricity. I remember showering at the gym every day and pooping at my neighbor's house down the street. And eventually we did up and we turned it into a communal living and working space for other Venture for America fellows. And throughout this time, the 2 years that it took us to do this, we had gotten to know a ton of other DIY rehabbers, real estate investors in the city, and befriended a lot of them. And we heard over and over about the different problems they faced with their properties. And a big one was property management. And that led us to the idea to start this startup called Castle, which was basically doing tech-powered property management for regular people, real estate investors. So we would find tenants, collect rent, and coordinate maintenance using automation and on-demand labor to make a way better experience for owners and tenants. At least that's how we tell the story, but the reality was a lot messier. I think there's this natural sort of tendency in startup world for founders to tell the origin stories of their companies in this very just so way. I was just going about living my life, and then I happened to discover this hole in the market and this incredible problem. And I realized, well, there had to be a better way. And I was so inspired to start this company, right? And that was sort of always how we told the story of this natural outgrowth of restoring the house and meeting these people and discovering this problem. And I mean, that story is not a lie, but it obscures the fact that there was a lot more trial and error, a lot of consciously being like, hey, we want to start a startup. What should we do? Like searching for ideas. So I always like to highlight that, the real story wasn't quite as smooth as that makes it sound. As for why I decided to start a company in the first place, even though I had been, thought I had no interest in it before, it was mostly just seeing the opportunity in front of me. It was my co-founder's idea originally, even though I became the CEO, and they recruited me. And I just think in general, my philosophy about like careers is that I don't really think there's much sense in having any kind of long-term plan for your career. I think it's mostly about taking opportunities that are in front of you and putting yourself in the position to be exposed to a lot of different opportunities. I kind of think about it as being like a frog trying to cross a river by jumping from lily pad to lily pad, where like you probably can't see the end of the river, but as long as you can see the next lily pad or two, you'll probably get where you're going. So we started this company in 2014 when we were 24, and we had absolutely no idea what we were doing. One of the first things we did was we were just like, okay, let's just find anyone who will pay us to do anything real estate related and just do that. And so we met this guy on, I think, the Detroit subreddit. And he was an out-of-state investor who had bought like a dozen properties sight unseen in the tax auction for like $1,000 each. And he hired us to just drive around and investigate these properties and report back. So me and my co-founder were like, just driving through, in retrospect, what were like pretty dangerous parts of Detroit with like whole blocks that had been almost leveled, going from house to house that looked basically like this, and like wandering around it inside, hoping that we wouldn't get beaten up by a squatter or that like the whole thing wouldn't collapse out from under us. And I think it really just illustrates like what the state of Detroit real estate what was like at the time. You had these crazy, people who'd never been to Detroit buying these handfuls of properties. We also didn't take things we didn't take ourselves very seriously in a way that maybe crossed the line into being a little bit overkill. My favorite example of this is that we decided to name our Delaware C Corp UN, so that when you read the whole name, it would be unincorporated, which we thought was hilarious until it turned out that I had to say the name of this company on the phone a lot. And every conversation ended up being like a who's on first routine until I finally learned to just start pronouncing it UN Incorporated so that people wouldn't get confused. But we eventually did get some early traction, released the first version of our product, started to grow in Detroit. And we were even featured in a documentary about Detroit startups called Generation Startup, which is honestly like pretty bad. It's a bad movie, but it was still pretty crazy to be, being followed around by a film crew. And eventually in the winter of 2016, we got into YC. And while we were in YC, we actually started to grow really fast. And some of that was because we were doing things right, but some of it was for totally coincidental reasons outside of our control. My favorite of those is that while we were in YC, one of our biggest local competitors was busted by the FBI for being a Ponzi scheme and shut down. And so there was like a flood of new customers coming onto the market. And so we were kind of a hot company coming out of YC, and we raised a big seed round by some famous investors. We ultimately grew to a team of 18 spread across 2 cities, Oakland and Detroit. And then it sort of all fell apart. Here's an extremely oversimplified explanation of why Castle failed. The first is that property management is an impossible business. One reason for this is that there's really, really low fault tolerance. If you build an app and it works 99% of the time, that's probably fine in most cases. But when you're managing properties, you're dealing with people's homes and you're dealing with investors' really valuable assets. And so if you screw things up 1% of the time, that could mean someone's going without heat for a few days, or it could put an investor in the red for the whole year. And realistically, we screwed up more than 1% of the time. By design, also, when an owner hires you to manage his properties, that person is hiring you so that they never have to think about their properties. And so what that means is that basically, if you do your job right, you're invisible. All your customer touch points are negative, and your happiest customers forget about you. And it's really hard to build a 5-star experience with that kind of dynamic. Detroit was also just like a really shitty market. I mean, I love Detroit as a place. I have a ton of ties there still. I think it's an incredible city. But as a place to be operating in the real estate market, it had a lot of challenges that other places don't have. There was an even higher percentage of con artists and scammers in the Detroit real estate market than in regular real estate. We had to deal with crazy things like, turning customers down because their property was on a block where every other house had been leveled. And there were all kinds of complicated dynamics with outside investors coming into a city that had been really disenfranchised in ways that were sometimes predatory and really difficult for us to deal with. And then the last reason is just that we were idiots. We were young. I mean, this was my second job ever. We made so many avoidable mistakes. But really, every startup fails for the same reason. And that reason is that the founders give up. I think when I first started a company, I sort of had this vision in my head that when your company failed, it was like dying in a video game, right? You just fell over the ledge and bam, game over. But in reality, it's always a choice, right? There's always a plan B or a plan C or a plan D. In our case, there was even more of a plan B than usual. We had, basically growth had been plateauing for a while. We had gone out to raise a Series A, couldn't raise the Series A, but we had an offer for $1 million bridge round on the table. And we ended up taking a step back and deciding not to take the money because we had lost faith in the business. But it's way harder, I think, when you have to make the choice than it would be in this world where you just fall off the ledge, because you're always second guessing yourself, you know? I remember when I finally told my co-founders that I thought it was time to throw in the towel, a part of me was totally devastated that they didn't push back. And it's weird. I think when you lose faith in your company, it's almost like a balloon popping in that it's irreversible. If right after we had decided to shut down, you know, Mark Andreessen had called me and said, I'll wire you 20 million tomorrow, I don't think we would have been able to do it. I think that, like, as a founder, you work so hard to construct this sort of edifice of artificial confidence that enables you to keep going. And once that is punctured, I don't really think you can ever reverse it. I'll say also, for me at least, when I say that I'd lost faith in the business, it wasn't just that I'd lost faith that we could succeed at building the company, although that was definitely part of it. I'd also started to really lose faith that Castle could be a force for good in the world. We started the company when we were 24 and we were young and naive, and, you know, really believed that we could do all these good things in the real estate world and fix a lot of problems. And that belief was pretty steadily beaten out of us in the course of building the company. I don't really think that real estate is an industry that can be fixed from the inside at all anymore. So 4 business lessons that I took away from this. I want to start by introducing this concept of service market fit and explaining why it isn't the same thing as product market fit, although it can often seem like it. So if your company makes a tech-enabled version of an existing service, like what we were doing, there will usually be demand right away, right? Property management is an existing business. It's been around for 100 years. Of course, there was going to be demand for it. Don't be fooled into thinking that that demand means you have product market fit. For a service business, until your product is key to making your service succeed, it's not product market fit. And this is because the idea of product market fit is that you're focusing on de-risking, on getting rid of your biggest risk. So for most startups, like with On Deck, our biggest risk is probably that people won't want to do On Deck. And so the more we grow, the more demand there is, the more we're de-risking our biggest risk. But with tech-enabled services, the key risk usually isn't demand. It's the risk that your service won't actually, and your product won't actually enable you to deliver your service in a way better way. So we were growing and growing, saying, wow, we're growing, we have product market fit, but we actually weren't proving a hypothesis around our biggest risk. And if I was doing it all over again, what I'd actually do is just spend way more time operating in like a closed beta and only start to scale once we really nailed the product, because premature scaling actually made de-risking way harder. The service started falling apart. We were spending so much time putting out fires that we couldn't invest in what we really needed to do. We got bigger and it was way harder to, you know, adjust things or make changes. And this is a trap I see a lot of service founders falling into. The next big lesson I learned is that the solution to every problem is growth. I spent a lot of time at Castle trying to address cultural problems. And in most cases, I think I should have ignored them and focused on growth instead. I'm not saying that culture doesn't matter. I actually think it's really important. But it's just that in a stagnating company, problems fester. And in a growing company, it's easy to make people happy. And so if you're not growing, everything else becomes way harder. A great example of this, there was a time in the last year of the company's life where there was a lot of grumbling around compensation. And I spent a lot of time interviewing people and rolling out, you know, really clear levels and bandings in a really transparent way so people could understand their salary progression. That might be appropriate for a later stage company. I think for us, it was actually a waste of time. The truth is, if we had just been growing faster, we could have just given everyone a nice raise, and that would have actually made everyone way happier than having, you know, clarity around compensation. And since a founder's time is zero sum, usually you should just focus on growing the company. The next lesson I'm calling work less, work more. So I think sometimes founders work a lot because there's a lot of work to be done. But I think a lot of other times we work just to distract ourselves from the reality that our fate is outside of our control. If I could do it all over again, I'd work a lot less so I could work a lot more. Because when I think about all the work I did at Castle, 80% of it didn't matter at all. And really the company's fate was driven by probably like a dozen key decisions I made over those 4 years. The work of making those key decisions better, though, is really difficult work. It doesn't look like work, right? It's like walking in the woods and thinking, but it also involves dealing with really difficult emotions. And so I think as a founder, it's so much easier to say, oh, well, I'll just sit here and send 100 more emails. I'll make 10 more calls. I'll fix these issues in GitHub, because that feels like work. And so you can tell yourself, no, this is the real work, even though you're really just using it as a way to distract yourself from having to do the deeper work that involves facing hard things and dealing with unpleasant emotions. And I would try not to fall into that trap again the second time. The last lesson, and this is the most important one, and one I find myself saying to founders all the time, is that there are two different ways of understanding your market. You'll hear all the time that like founders need to really understand their market, right? And most of the time, people are talking about that in a practical sense. Understanding, is this a viable business idea? Will my product succeed in the market? And we were really good at that. I mean, one thing I'm really proud of is that Castle was the first tech-powered property management company. And even though we failed, this is like a big space now. There's lots of founders trying to do tech-powered property management stuff. I get hit up by investors investing in this space all the time. Actually, I don't know if Brienne is on the call, but Brienne's boyfriend is running a company like this. He actually had reached out to me like a year before I met Brienne through On Deck to talk about it. But there's another way of understanding your market that's equally important, and that's emotionally, right? It's how will operating in this market for years make me feel? And that's a form of understanding our market that we did not get right at all. You know, we had started the company being inspired by this very unrepresentative group of real estate investors we knew in Detroit, these rehabbers in this incredible community who were by and large really good people, motivated by the right reasons. And, you know, as many of you can probably know now, like obviously that's not what real estate is like in America at all, right? But we didn't know that at the time. And by the time Castle shut down, I fucking hated almost everyone we interacted in the real estate world, aside from our team. I hated a lot of our partners. I hated a lot of our customers, and it was just really depressing. And that's one thing I really like about working at On Deck, is that like I like the people that we're serving. I like the people we work with. You know, it's complicated because there is a degree to which I'm really motivated by the idea of starting businesses in really shitty markets, because I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement there. But when you start a business in a shitty market, you get the shit all over you, right? And that really sucks. 4 personal lessons. First one is just to take care of yourself. You know, no one benefits when you suffer. I think, for me at least, as a young, inexperienced founder, I had a really big martyr complex, right? I think that there is this narrative around how, you know, founders have to be so devoted to their company and just totally obsessed. And I think that's really destructive in a lot of ways, because it creates this impossible yardstick that you feel like you're always coming up short when you measure yourself against. And so I think I, you know, mostly subconsciously got it in my head of like, well, if I'm suffering so much for this company, that proves I'm committed enough, right? Like the sort of the worse my life is going in other areas, like that proves that I'm devoted. And so I didn't do a very good job maintaining a lot of relationships. I never got enough sleep. You know, I would take a break from working by partying really hard, which is a mental break, but not a physical break. And I was really burning the candle at both ends. And in retrospect, it was all such a mistake, right? First off, no one doubted that I was committed to the company. I look back on it and I cared so much. And I think everyone knew that. But also, not only was this bad for me personally, it was counterproductive for the company. I would have been a much better leader if I had been treating myself better. The next lesson I took away is to embrace failure. Early on when I started the company, I was really afraid of failing. But once we actually failed, I actually found it extremely freeing. First off, it was an opportunity to think about what I wanted. I think there's this idea that, you know, as a founder, you start a company because you want freedom, because you want to be your own boss. But like, that's all bullshit. Like, as a founder, you're less free than you've ever been. I didn't have one boss. I had a million bosses. The market was my boss. Our customers were my boss. Our investors were my boss. The team was my boss. With a regular job, like if you don't like it, you can quit. But even as a founder, like that's pretty hard to do. And it wasn't that I wanted to quit. It was just that, you know, I had spent every day for so long waking up and thinking, what does the company need from me? Not what do I want? And when I got the opportunity to think about what I wanted again, it was kind of like using a muscle I hadn't used in a really long time. I also just think that failure is fundamentally more interesting. Of course, there's a lot to be learned from the stories of people who've succeeded, but at least personally, like I don't trust anyone who hasn't suffered at least a little bit. And I'm more interested in hearing the stories of people's failures. I also found that failing really lowered the pressure for me in a way that has been really valuable. And it's something I've really tried to lean into. I mean, y'all have probably noticed that I, in admittedly a sort of tongue-in-cheek, semi-joking way, have a sort of like self-consciously adopted like being a failure as part of my identity. And obviously I don't really think I'm a complete failure. I have pretty high self-confidence, but I found that, yeah, just starting from the position that like everything I've done has failed just lowers the pressure a lot, makes me feel way more free to take risks because like, what do I have to lose, And so I've tried to really consciously embrace that as part of my identity. Every single thing that I created at Castle or built at Castle is long gone, except for the relationships that I formed along the way. I wasn't always good at maintaining my relationships outside of the company, but I did work really hard to maintain my relationships with people on the team. And that was not easy. It took a lot of really conscious work, especially when the company wasn't really doing well. But I still have really good relationships with the team. I mean, obviously you guys know there's Castle alums at On Deck, really good relationships with my co-founders, and things got rocky in a lot of those relationships at times because it's really hard, especially when the company is failing. But ultimately your relationships are all that lasts. And that's something I will always keep in mind. And the last like personal lesson I'm taking away is just to enjoy the ride. This was actually one of our core values at Castle. This is a poster that was hanging in our office. And Barry at Castle used to say all the time, like, these are the good old days, even when things were really hard. And looking back, now 4 or 5 years later, that was just so true. And I think in general in my life, not just with Castle, there are so many times, so many moments in my life that were really hard and like kind of sucked at the time, but that I'm really intensely nostalgic for now. And in general in life, so many of my biggest regrets are just not enjoying myself more, even despite the fact that this was a core value. And so it's a battle, but I really always try to keep this in mind. So to sort of start to wrap things up, I mean, this is this question I'm asked all the time, right? Like, knowing all of this, would you do it all again? I think that regret is just a story we tell ourselves. I tell myself I have no regrets, quote unquote, because the alternative is too painful to contemplate, right? What if it was all a big waste of time? But I also think that the truth is elusive and that you should just pick the narrative of your life that serves you best. And for me, the narrative that serves me best is that Castle was an amazing experience and that I have no regrets. And so that's sort of where I've decided to land. When I think about whether or not I'd ever start another company, I think about how my mental model of entrepreneurship is actually very similar to my mental model of addiction, right? The compulsive need to continue certain behaviors or actions despite provably harmful consequences. I look back on my time at Castle and part of me thinks, how could I possibly ever put myself through that again? And part of me thinks that I caught the bug and that I can't wait to go back. But I also think entrepreneurship is really, in the bigger picture, just about being a way of life, right? It's not just about startups. I don't know whether I'll ever start another venture-backed company again, but I do know that the drive to create something out of nothing and to often do that with other people is going to be a really big part of my life forever. And that manifests itself in all kinds of ways, right? It manifests itself in my newsletter, my super secret diary, quick plug. I write weekly on a lot of the same stuff I'm talking about here. So if you like this, you'll probably like that. It manifests itself in the adult summer camp I run every year, and which I just included in this slide so I could have an excuse to show this picture of Barry Jello wrestling. I'll leave this up for 5 or 10 seconds before I move on. It's also one of the things that I really like about working at On Deck is that I think that, I mean, this is a chaotic company, but the upside of that is that there's opportunity for everyone here to sort of display entrepreneurial spirit, even if they aren't, directly being an entrepreneur themselves. And I feel like I'm being able to work that muscle, on a daily basis in the broader philosophical sense. Also though, as I've gotten older, I've really rethought my relationship to ambition. Growing up, I always wanted to be rich and successful. But then I met a bunch of rich and successful people and they pretty much all sucked. So now I just want to be happy. And I think that's actually a lot harder. So in conclusion, there really is no good conclusion. Starting a startup was amazing, beautiful, miserable, and torturous all at once. It enriched my life immeasurably, and it realistically probably took years off of it. it made me feel more deeply alive than I ever had before. And it made me also incredibly disconnected with certain parts of myself. It helped me become a better person immensely. And it also forced me to make moral compromises that I'm still uncomfortable with. It was fundamental in shaping me into the person I am today, but it was also something I really kind of did on a whim. And it's an experience that is inherently like essentially unsummarizable. And yet it's also one I find myself being asked to summarize all the time. And that's it. Thanks for watching, everyone.